April 12, 1946-217 a.m., Mojave Desert, California. The wind was screaming through the hangar doors, carrying the scent of burned kerosene and wet metal. Under the flicker of a single bulb, a man in a torn leather jacket stood over a half-assembled jet engine that no one believed could ever run. His name was Dr. Walter Reeve, a war-worn engineer who had built miracles for a nation that no longer wanted to listen. Outside the U.S., Air Force was celebrating the dawn of the jet age. Inside this hangar, one forgotten mechanic was trying to prove the age hadn't even begun. The desert air quivered as Reeve turned the starter switch. Sparks flashed. The compressor blades screamed, then died with a choking hiss. Another failure. He slammed his fist against the casing metal, echoing like thunder. Behind him, the radio whispered news of victory parades in New York, the sound of marching bands celebrating peace built on technology he now knew was flawed. The jets that roared across the sky were fast, yes, but unstable, dangerous, blind to the truth of the wind. That was the paradox. The future everyone worshipped was already broken, and only one man could see it. Smoke drifted past the windows, mixing with desert dust as Reeve whispered to himself, "If I can make the air behave, maybe humanity will finally listen." No. Generals watched him. No reporters cared. But in that forgotten night, the foundation of the modern jet engine was being born out of stubbornness, loneliness, and fire. Because history isn't written by the victors, it's rewritten by those who refuse to stop fighting physics itself. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit like, subscribe, and share, because this one is only beginning. The roar of failure still echoed through the hangar long after the engine went silent. Reeve didn't move. The desert night pressed against the glass, heavy and endless. He could taste metal in the air, that bitter scent of burnt oil and humiliation. Somewhere, deep inside the machine, a tiny ball bearing was probably shattered, a microscopic failure in a world that demanded perfection. But what haunted him wasn't the sound, it was the silence that followed the confirmation that no one else cared whether the air would ever obey. He had been an engineer long before the world called itself modern. He'd seen propellers give way to turbines, wings evolve from wood and canvas to aluminum and rivets. But for all the progress, the same flaw kept returning like a ghost instability. Every new jet promised speed beyond imagination, and every few weeks another test pilot died chasing it. Engines flamed out. Wings tore apart. No one wanted to admit it, but the sky had turned into a graveyard for ambition. In the weeks after the war, funding was everywhere, contracts for jet prototypes, research labs glowing day and night with new ideas. But all of them were chasing power, not understanding. They built bigger engines, hotter chambers, heavier frames. Reeve saw the reports stacking on his desk: Mach instability, compressor stall, thermal fatigue. Words that meant men were dying because airflow, the invisible thing everyone took for granted, refused to behave. When he tried to speak about it in meetings, the younger engineers laughed. "Walter, the future is thrust, not philosophy," one said. "We're not poets. We're scientists." He smiled tightly, hiding the fury behind his calm. Because to him, air wasn't chaos. It was language, something you could learn to listen to if you stopped shouting at it with brute force. So he went quiet. He stopped attending briefings, stopped arguing. He spent his nights at the edge of the runway, sitting on an overturned toolbox, watching test flights slice through the moonlight. The jets howled across the desert sky, but he didn't watch the planes, he watched the trails. He noticed how the vapor twisted unnaturally, how the wake of pressure behind the intakes shimmered in broken patterns like water striking a rock. And then one night, as a prototype F-84 passed overhead, its afterburner flickering like a heartbeat, he saw it, the jet's exhaust plume bending slightly sideways before stabilizing again. Most would call it a trick of the eye. Reeve knew better. The air wasn't angry. It was reacting. He returned to his drafting table, the same one he'd bought 20 years earlier when he was a junior engineer drawing piston heads. He unrolled a blank sheet of vellum and began sketching not a new engine but the invisible world around it, the pressure waves, the eddies, the violent dance of air molecules. He drew curved arrows, turbulence maps, and finally a shape that looked nothing like the sharp-edged air intakes every manufacturer swore by. His idea was absurd: a curved intake throat, a channel that would slow and straighten the air before feeding it to the turbine. Everyone else wanted speed. He wanted control. The next morning, he took his drawings to his supervisor, a man named Barrett who had the personality of a cigar stub. Barrett flipped through the pages with a look of weary amusement. "So you're telling me the solution to high-speed instability is slowing the air down?" Reeve nodded. "Not slowing, taming. You can't make air obey by force." Barrett sighed, tossed the papers back. "Walter, this isn't a monastery, it's a jet lab. You either build something that breaks Mach 1 or you're out of relevance." That afternoon, Reeve packed his notes and walked out. No press release, no farewell ceremony. He wasn't quitting engineering, he was quitting noise. He found a rundown warehouse near the edge of the Mojave testing range and rented it for $20 a month. The owner didn't ask what he planned to do with it. The world was full of strange men chasing forgotten dreams after the war. He began working alone. The nights blurred into days, the silence broken only by the metallic click of his slide rule and the occasional bark of coyotes in the distance. He built makeshift ducting from scrap aluminum, bolted together parts scavenged from junked aircraft, and borrowed measuring instruments from old colleagues who pitied him. Every time he tested a prototype, something failed. Vibration tearing seams, air collapsing in on itself, readings scattering into chaos. But failure never scared him, indifference did. That's why he kept a journal by the workbench recording every detail of the airflow tests. "The air fights back when forced," he wrote one night, "but yields when guided. Like a conversation, not a command." He didn't realize then that he was rewriting the future of jet design. Weeks passed. The Mojave heat became unbearable, and the hangar's tin roof turned into a furnace. Sweat burned his eyes as he leaned over a new model, a smaller version of his curved intake carved meticulously from balsa wood. He set it up in front of a small wind tunnel made from an old ventilation fan. The motor hummed. He watched the smoke streamers curve into the intake, expecting chaos, and instead saw them flow smooth, steady, almost elegant. The air no longer twisted in violent spirals. It bent, then straightened like a disciplined wave. His breath caught. He shut off the fan and stood still for nearly a minute, afraid to move, afraid to break the moment. He ran his finger along the contour of the intake, tracing its simplicity. No sharp angles, no forced compression, just a natural path. "You listen to it," he whispered. "You don't fight it." When he presented the data to an old friend at Wright Field 2 weeks later, the man frowned at the graphs. "This is beautiful work, Walt," he said carefully, "but the Air Force won't fund poetry. They wanted numbers, thrust ratios, altitude performance." Reeve's design didn't promise more power, it promised stability, and no one wanted to pay for something they couldn't see explode faster. Still, word began to spread in quiet corners. A few young engineers came to visit the warehouse after hours drawn by curiosity or rebellion. They called themselves the Night Shift, and they believed in him. Together they refined the shape, measuring angles with cigarette smoke and flashlight beams. The first time one of them saw the airflow smooth out across the test chamber, he shouted like a boy at a baseball game. Reeve just smiled. But not everyone was cheering. Barrett found out about the off-the-books experiments and sent a formal warning: cease unauthorized testing or face legal consequences. The letter was signed with bureaucratic venom stamped in red. Reeve pinned it to the wall like a trophy. "If they threaten you," he told the young engineers, "you're probably getting close to the truth." By late autumn, the prototype was ready, a crude metal intake attached to a small jet turbine he'd borrowed under a friend's name. The Night Shift gathered around as Reeve connected the fuel lines. "If this blows up," one of them joked, "we'll be famous for 5 seconds. Reeve smiled faintly. "Then let's make those seconds count." The engine screamed to life. Flames licked from the exhaust, then stabilized into a perfect blue cone. The sound was different, cleaner, steadier. The instruments barely trembled. Reeve leaned close, watching the gauges as if they were holy text. Air pressure held constant. No surge, no collapse. It was working. Then, just as the others began to cheer, the turbine coughed and sputtered. The compressor blades shattered, a burst of silver shards tearing through the casing. Everyone dove for cover. When the dust settled, Reeve stood among the debris, a small grin breaking through the soot on his face. "Did you see it?" he whispered. It held. For 12 seconds, it held. That night, after the others left, he sat alone again beneath the single flickering bulb. He redrew the curve, this time smoother, tighter, more patient. The desert wind rattled the doors as if testing his resolve. But the idea was alive now, and ideas once born do not die quietly. The first step had been taken. The air had answered, and Walter Reeve, the man no one believed in, finally had a reason to keep fighting the invisible war between chaos and control. The explosion left a black scar on the hangar floor. Twisted blades glittered among the debris like shrapnel from a mechanical war. Reeve didn't flinch. He brushed metal dust from his coat and stared at the smoking wreckage, as though it were speaking a language only he could hear. The others, his night shift, stood frozen, coughing through the haze. Someone muttered, 12 seconds isn't much. Reeve turned slowly, eyes lit with something fierce. It's 12 seconds more than anyone's ever had. That was the rhythm of their lives, brief triumphs drowned in longer nights of failure. The hangar became a second home, a battlefield of drafts, broken parts, and exhaustion. They scavenged everything they could find, spare turbines, pressure sensors from junkyards, even a refrigerator motor, once repurposed to measure airflow turbulence. Each experiment ended the same way: smoke, noise, destruction, but every failure wrote a new equation on the walls of their memory. As the months passed, the team grew from 3 to 6. They were misfits, a mechanic discharged from the Navy, a college dropout, obsessed with airflow photography, a mathematician who once worked on bomb trajectories. None of them fit the polished image of the aerospace elite, but they shared something more valuable: faith in an old man chasing the wind. When the lights flickered at midnight and the turbines whined like beasts in chains, they called themselves the Listeners, because that's what Reeve demanded: not control, not domination, but listening. Their experiments became ritual. They started every test by shutting off the radio, killing the noise, waiting for the desert to hold its breath. Then, Reeve would say, "Now, let's ask the air again," and they would feed power to the turbine. Sometimes the roar built slowly into a clean hum, other times it screamed and died in seconds. They patched holes, rewired circuits, replaced melted bearings. One by one, the failures piled up like tombstones of obsession. By late spring, money was gone. Reeve sold his truck to buy more fuel. The younger ones took odd jobs in nearby towns, fixing radios, painting houses, anything to keep the experiments alive. Barrett, his old supervisor, sent another letter, this one colder, threatening to revoke his engineering license. "You're risking lives," it said. Reeve laughed bitterly. "I'm trying to save them." The physical toll was worse. His hands shook from sleepless nights, burns traced the back of his forearms from engine backfires. Once a turbine disc shattered and a fragment cut across his shoulder. The blood soaked through his shirt, but he refused to stop. "It's just the air fighting back," he said through gritted teeth. "It knows we're close." But even his faith cracked under the weight of silence. One night after another failure, he sat outside the hangar, while the others cleaned up. The desert stretched endless before him, the stars sharp enough to cut. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke curl upward, then break apart. "That's it," he murmured. "That's the moment. The air resists the wrong shape. It collapses under its own pressure." He rushed inside, adrenaline erasing fatigue, and sketched a new design: narrower intake, deeper curve, smoother walls. The next morning, the team built it. They called it Wind Ear 3. The name came from one of the kids who said the intake looked like the ear of some mythical creature, listening to the wind instead of fighting it. It took 2 weeks of welding and filing to finish. When they finally mounted it to the turbine, even Reeve was trembling. They started the engine. At first it stuttered the usual cough of resistance, then it caught and held. The sound changed. The air didn't roar this time. It sang. A steady, even tone, low and powerful, like breath flowing through a flute. Instruments stabilized. Pressure held. The smoke streamers curved gracefully through the intake and out the exhaust without distortion. For a few precious minutes, everything worked. And then a shriek, metal tearing itself apart. The engine ripped free from its mounts, flames spewing like a wounded dragon. They doused it with extinguishers, coughing through the acrid smoke. When the fire finally died, half the hangar wall was scorched black. Reeve fell to his knees, not from fear but from exhaustion. His voice cracked. We almost had it. We almost. Then he stopped. The mathematician handed him the data recorder, its tape still spinning. Reeve replayed the numbers, watching the readout spike, then stabilize. For 84 seconds, airflow remained perfectly laminar. 84 seconds of peace in the chaos of combustion. It was enough. The team erupted in disbelief. 84 seconds, someone shouted. Reeve only smiled faintly. It's not the time, he said. It's the truth inside those seconds. From that night onward, something changed. The failures still came, but they no longer felt meaningless. Every broken blade, every burned-out sensor became a clue, a breadcrumb leading closer to something real. The air was beginning to answer their questions. They adjusted the curve, polished the metal smoother than glass, changed the angle by fractions of degrees. Each modification cost days of work and weeks of sleep, but each test lasted a little longer. Then came the storm, a real one. A summer monsoon rolled across the Mojave with a vengeance rain, lightning, dust. The team wanted to wait it out, but Reeve insisted. If we can't tame the air in chaos, we've learned nothing. The wind screamed through the hangar as they powered up the new prototype. Rain lashed the walls. Lightning flashed across the desert, illuminating the engine's silver body. They ran the test anyway. The turbine spun, roaring against the storm outside. Reeve's coat flapped violently, the instruments shaking under his hands. The intake swallowed air thick with sand and rain, but the flow stayed smooth. "It's holding," shouted the mechanic. The data needles steadied. For the first time, the storm didn't matter, the machine was breathing on its own terms. Then lightning struck nearby, the power grid shorted, and the lights died. The turbine spun down in darkness. For a moment there was only the sound of rain on metal. No one spoke. Then Reeve laughed, hoarse, wild, alive. "You hear that?" he said. "Even the storm couldn't break it." When the sun rose, the hangar was a wreck. Water pooled across the floor, tools scattered, circuits fried. But the intake stood untouched, gleaming beneath the soft light. They gathered around it silently. Reeve placed his palm against the metal. It was warm, alive. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we've stopped fighting the air. We've started speaking its language." It wasn't victory yet. They were still broke, still unwanted, still hunted by bureaucracy. But they had proof, a prototype that lived through fire and storm, a whisper of the impossible made real. For the first time, the desert didn't feel like exile. It felt like the beginning of flight itself. And as the morning wind swept through the broken doors, carrying the scent of burnt fuel and rain, Reeve closed his eyes and smiled. "Now," he said, "let's build one that never stops." By autumn, the desert had turned colder, but the fire in Reeve's hangar only burned hotter. Word of his illegal experiments had leaked beyond Mojave. Someone from the night shift, desperate for recognition or funding, had spoken to a reporter. Within weeks, a government inspection team arrived. Their trucks rolled in at dawn grey against the sand, the kind of colour that never meant anything good. The leader, Colonel Harlan, stepped out with a clipboard and a smirk. "Dr. Reeve," he said, "you've been conducting unsanctioned propulsion tests on restricted property. We're shutting you down." The team gathered behind Reeve, silent. The hangar, once filled with sound and motion, now felt like a courtroom. Harlan walked slowly past the prototype, tapping it with his pen. "You really think this ridiculous intake curve will save American aviation?" he sneered. "Jets don't need poetry, Doctor. They need power." Reeve met his eyes. "Power without control is suicide," he said quietly. Harlan ignored him. Within an hour, the hangar was sealed, the prototypes confiscated, the night shift dismissed under threat of legal action. For the first time, the hangar went silent, not by Reeve's choice, but by someone else's will. That night, he drove alone into the desert headlights, slicing through the dust. His life's work sat in government trucks heading north, labeled evidence. He pulled over miles from anywhere and sat on the hood, staring at the stars. The desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, the same wind he'd spent years trying to understand. It mocked him now, or maybe comforted him, he couldn't tell. Days turned into weeks. He received a formal suspension notice from the Aeronautics Commission, barred from testing, barred from consulting. His name was being erased. The team scattered, one to Boeing, another drafted into the Air Force. The hangar fell silent again, this time for real. But not everyone had given up. One night, as Reeve sat in his dark workshop, the door creaked open. It was Elias Ward, one of his youngest protégés, holding a stack of papers and a trembling smile. "Sir," he said, "before they shut us down, I made copies of the data logs." He laid them out on the table, columns of numbers, airflow graphs, stability ratios. "You were right. The intake didn't just survive the storm, it increased efficiency by 12% under variable conditions." Reeve stared at the numbers, disbelief giving way to awe. The proof was there, buried in the chaos. The answer had been whispering all along. They spent the entire night recalculating, replotting, overlaying data. By dawn, it was undeniable. The curved intake didn't just stabilize flow, it amplified it. The turbulence it absorbed was being converted into steady kinetic energy. In other words, the design wasn't fighting the air anymore, it was using it. They had to show it. But how? The hangar was sealed, and no one would fund a disgraced engineer. Then a stroke of luck or fate. An old contact from Wright Field, a quiet British test pilot named Harris, called. "I've seen your work," Harris said, "and between us, Rolls-Royce has a prototype engine needing precisely what you've built. If you can get to Dayton by next week, I can give you 10 minutes in front of the board." 10 minutes. That was all they had. Reeve pawned his last possessions to afford the trip, his watch, his drafting tools, even the leather jacket that had survived 100 desert nights. When he arrived at Wright Field, the hangar was massive, polished, sterile. Rows of suits and uniforms lined the benches, their faces blank with skepticism. He stood before them with nothing but a sketch and the raw conviction of a man who had seen the truth. "Gentlemen," he began, "you've all been chasing power. I've been chasing the wind's forgiveness." Murmurs rippled across the room. He pointed to the chart. "This curve, this simple natural path, stabilizes the flow, allows the engine to breathe. It's not a dream. It's math verified under storm conditions." They let him finish. Then came the laughter. A general whispered something to a scientist who smirked. Harlan was there too, leaning back in his chair. "You expect us to rewrite our engines because you claim the air forgives," he said. "You're finished, Doctor." The decision was made. They adjourned without ceremony. Reeve stood there, the echo of boots fading around him, the world once again turning its back. He gathered his papers, ready to leave, when Harris approached quietly. "Don't give up yet," he said, slipping him a folded note. "Come to Hangar 12 tonight." At midnight, Reeve entered the hangar under dim lights. Harris and 2 technicians stood beside a test engine mounted to a thrust stand. "We installed your intake," Harris said. "Figured we'd let the numbers decide who's right." Reeve's hands trembled as they powered up the engine. The turbine roared, the instruments flickered, and then a miracle. The vibration curve flattened, the airflow remained smooth even as thrust climbed past previous limits. Harris grinned. "She's holding steady. God help me, she's singing." They pushed it further. At 102% rated thrust, where every other engine coughed and died, this one held firm. Flames streamed clean and blue, no shudder, no surge. The room filled with the low, thunderous hum of stability. Reeve felt tears sting his eyes. Then Harris cut the power. The hangar fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't defeat, it was reverence. Harris turned to him. "They won't believe it yet," he said, "but they will. You've just changed how the sky breathes." Reeve didn't answer. He simply rested his hand on the cooling metal, feeling it vibrate faintly beneath his palm like a heartbeat. For years he had fought the air. Tonight the air had finally bowed its head. He walked out into the cold morning before dawn, the horizon painted in silver and orange. The world still thought he was finished. But somewhere inside that sealed hangar a new era had just begun, and Reeve knew it. The wind was listening now. The morning after the secret test at Wright Field, the engineers pretended nothing had happened. The paperwork vanished, the hangar was sealed, and Harris simply nodded at Reeve, as if they were strangers. But a week later, a discreet memo circulated through the Air Force's Experimental Division prototype intake design demonstrates exceptional stability at high thrust. Recommend adaptation for combat engines under project codename Whisper. Reeve knew what that meant. They had buried his name but adopted his work, and strangely he didn't fight it. He had spent years shouting into the wind. Now his invention would speak for itself. Months passed. The Korean peninsula erupted in fire and sky. Jet dogfights tore across the cold horizon where F-86 Sabres met Soviet-built MiG-15 seconds in deadly spirals of speed and flame. The newspapers called it the First War of the Jet Age. For the pilots, it was hell. Engines flamed out, compressors stalled mid-turn, and men vanished into the clouds swallowed by their own machines. Then something changed. A new batch of Sabres began arriving at the front identical on the outside, but inside, the air intake a subtle curve, a polished throat, a whisper of an idea made metal. The pilots didn't know the science, but they felt it. The bird breathes easier, one wrote home. She climbs smoother, holds longer. It's like flying a living thing. The Air Force credited the improvement to minor aerodynamic revisions. Reeve read that line in the morning paper with a faint smile. Minor, he murmured. Yes. The kind that saves lives. Through December 1950 and into the brutal winter of 51, the Sabres began turning the tide. Reports flooded in fewer stalls, tighter climbs, longer engagements. Pilots once forced to break off could now push their jets higher faster into the heart of enemy formations. One after another, MiGs fell flaming from the thin, cold sky. The kill ratio shifted dramatically from even odds to nearly 9-1. Behind those numbers hid something invisible. The airflow inside each intake stayed steady, unbroken, alive. No one mentioned Reeve. The official communiques praised American engineering excellence, industrial collaboration advancements in turbine dynamics. But in the hangars of the 4th Fighter Wing, pilots began scratching something onto their jet noses, tiny hand-painted curves sweeping upward like a signature. It started with one pilot, then a dozen. They called it the ear. When asked why, they'd say, because this thing listens to the wind. Far away, in the same Mojave hangar where it all began. Reeve heard the rumors on a crackling radio. He closed his eyes as static hissed between the broadcast and imagined the sound of those engines, the hum that once filled his nights. Harris sent a brief letter a month later, just one page. It worked. They'll never know your name, but the sky remembers. He folded the letter carefully, placed it inside his old notebook, and went back to work. The war had proven the design, but the world kept moving faster. Jets were evolving. Supersonic flight was no longer a dream. It was a race. Reeve watched from the sidelines as sleek new aircraft appeared, phone 100 seconds, phone 104 seconds each, pushing the limits of speed and heat. And though no one said it aloud, every one of them carried a shadow of his curve within its intake. Then, one spring morning in 1953, an Air Force courier arrived at his door. "Dr. Reeve," the man said awkwardly, "you've been invited to observe a demonstration at Edwards." He handed him a sealed envelope. Inside, confidential, high-altitude supersonic evaluation project Whirlwind. At the airfield, Reeve stood behind a chain-link fence as the new prototype, a polished silver arrow, roared down the runway. Its engine used a refined version of his intake, now standardized and manufactured by the thousands. The jet climbed the sound, deepening into a thunder that rolled across the desert. At Mach 1.2, where others had once choked and died, this one cut through the air like a blade through silk. No shudder, no surge. Just silence, the clean, impossible silence of a machine that had finally made peace with the wind. The crowd erupted. Generals clapped. Engineers took notes. Cameras clicked. Reeve said nothing. He stood perfectly still, the wind whipping through his greying hair, the sun glaring off the metal. His hands, scarred and burned from years of trial, trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of knowing he'd just watched his life's work ascend beyond him. Later that afternoon, as the test pilot stepped down from the cockpit, a colonel asked him how it felt. The pilot grinned. "Feels like she doesn't fight the sky anymore. She dances with it." Reeve turned away, unable to hide the emotion tightening in his chest. He walked out across the tarmac alone. No medals, no applause. But in the distance, the jet taxied back toward the hangar, sunlight gleaming off its intake curve, the same geometry he had once drawn in pencil on torn vellum under a single flickering bulb. He stopped, looked back one last time, and smiled. "You listened," he whispered. "That's all I ever asked." The wind carried the words away across the runway, across the desert that had witnessed his failures and his faith. Somewhere, far above, the silver jet vanished into the sun, leaving behind a thin contrail that shimmered like a scar healing in the sky. That evening, Reeve sat outside his old hangar, watching the horizon burn gold and red. The desert was quiet now, except for the soft hum of distant engines, the sound of his invention echoing through generations that would never know his name. And somehow that was enough. For every failure, every scar, every lonely night spent arguing with the air, this was the answer. The machine had learned to listen. The sky had learned to forgive. And Walter Reeve, the man who once fought the wind with bare hands and stubborn faith, finally felt the peace of a victory that needed no witnesses. Years passed. The wars that had defined generations became black and white newsreels, fading beneath the static of a new era. Jets grew faster, sleeker, louder. Space itself became the next frontier. But somewhere in the hum of every engine that cut through the sky, there was an echo of a man who once whispered to the wind. By the late 1960s, Walter Reeve was nearly forgotten. His old hangar in Mojave had collapsed under years of storms, its roof rusted through, and its walls overrun by dust and tumbleweeds. Most of the men he had worked beside were gone. Harris had died in a test flight. The young night shift engineers had scattered into corporate labs and government programs. Yet pieces of his curved intake design lived on embedded deep within every jet turbine, every airliner crossing oceans at 30,000 feet. It was never called the Reeve intake. It had no monument, no plaque. It didn't need one. The world carried his signature in motion, not in marble. One spring morning, long after the Mojave skies had fallen silent, a young aerospace student named Elias Ward, Reeve's last apprentice, stood before a lecture hall at Caltech. He was showing photographs from a new NASA project, the sleek black silhouette of the SR-71 Blackbird glinting at the edge of space. On the screen, a close-up of its twin intakes, each curved, each perfectly smoothed, filled the room. Ward smiled quietly. This shape, he told his students, wasn't born in a laboratory. It was born in a desert under a single light bulb by a man who refused to stop listening to air. The students leaned forward. Did he ever get credit? One asked. Ward shook his head. Not officially. But every time a pilot climbs into the stratosphere without fear of flameout, he's flying inside that man's dream. After the lecture, Ward drove east back toward Mojave. The road hadn't changed, just more sand, fewer signs, and an emptiness that felt almost sacred. He found what was left of the hangar and stepped inside. The floor was covered in dust, the old turbines long gone, but the faint outlines of drafting tables were still etched into the concrete. He knelt down and ran his hand across one of the scars in the floor, where an explosion had once burned through steel. In the corner lay an old half-rusted sign, Reeve Propulsion Research Private. He lifted it gently, brushing off the dirt, and saw faint lettering beneath, scratched by hand. If I can make the air behave, maybe humanity will listen. Ward stood there for a long time, listening to the desert wind push through the broken panels. It still made the same low moan, the same voice Reeve had followed half a century earlier, and in that sound there was something alive, something human. Across the world, aviation was entering its next revolution. Civil airliners, like the Boeing 747, were redefining travel, carrying hundreds of passengers across continents in hours. Every design bore the mark of Reeve's philosophy: smooth curves, controlled flow, a harmony between power and air. Engineers spoke of aerodynamic forgiveness, a phrase borrowed from one of his old journals. None of them knew his name. Yet his presence lingered like wind, carving unseen patterns across the earth. In 1973, the first oil crisis forced nations to rethink efficiency. The same engineers who once worshipped thrust now chased fuel economy. They returned to Reeve's writings, rediscovered his obsession with laminar flow and smooth pressure gradients. They found that his forgotten experiments had predicted decades earlier what modern flight needed to survive. Quietly, his notebooks began circulating through university libraries, copied, annotated, revered. One night, Ward was invited to speak at a symposium in Seattle, where he unveiled a recovered prototype of Reeve's original intake, polished, dented, still bearing the fingerprints of its maker. As he set it on the stage, the room fell silent. This, Ward said, wasn't built for fame or fortune. It was built because one man believed the air could be reasoned with. He proved that progress isn't the conquest of nature, it's the conversation with it. A journalist asked if Reeve had ever regretted giving everything away. Ward smiled sadly. He once told me that wind doesn't owe us obedience. It only gives us mercy if we learn to listen. Outside that night, the rain swept across the city. Ward stood by the window, watching the runways glow under floodlights as aircraft lifted through the storm. Their engines howled, but within that sound was order, a rhythm carved from chaos. The legacy was everywhere invisible but undeniable. Years later, when Ward himself was old, NASA invited him to the rollout of a new aircraft, the world's first reusable spaceplane. Its intake system, designed for atmospheric re-entry, used a principle identical to Reeve's curved flow path. The lead engineer, unaware of the lineage, explained it proudly. "We've taught the air not to fight us." Ward smiled. "No," he whispered. "The air taught us." He thought of Reeve then, not the broken man after the shutdown, not the quiet genius lost in the desert, but the moment in the storm, standing before a burning engine and daring to ask the wind for peace. That image had never left him. In the years that followed, Reeve's story resurfaced in fragments, footnotes in textbooks, oral tales among test pilots, a faded photograph in a museum exhibit labeled Unknown Engineer Mojave 1949, yet somehow that anonymity made his legacy purer. The absence of credit became its own monument, an embodiment of his philosophy. The work matters more than the name attached to it. And perhaps that was the truest victory. His voice dissolved into the machines, his thoughts turned into motion. His fingerprints now streaked across the stratosphere in contrails and curved steel in every whisper of air that passed through an intake without turbulence. One quiet evening, decades later, long after Ward's passing, a young engineer browsing declassified archives stumbled upon Reeve's original hand-drawn curve, the same arc that changed aviation forever. In the margin, faint pencil lines spelled a single sentence: "You don't command the wind, you earn its trust." The engineer paused, tracing the words with her finger, feeling the weight of them. Outside, she could hear the distant hum of a passing jet. It was smooth, constant, unwavering. She smiled. And so the circle closed. From the roaring hangar in the Mojave to the cold vacuum of space, one idea had endured: that progress isn't built on domination, but on harmony. In the end, Walter Reeve didn't die in history books. He lived in motion in every engine that breathed without fear, in every pilot who trusted the air again, in every generation of dreamers who still stood beneath the open sky and believed they could talk to the wind. Because true genius isn't born to be remembered. It's born to keep the wings flying long after the name has vanished into the clouds. The wind still carries his answer. The sun was sinking low over the Mojave Desert, painting the sky in bands of copper and violet. The air was still warm, trembling faintly over the horizon like a memory refusing to fade. Walter Reeve's hangar, once alive with thunder and fire, was quiet. Now its roof half collapsed, its walls swallowed by time. But in the stillness, something lingered, a hum soft and constant, like the sky itself, remembering his voice. A group of engineers from a nearby aerospace firm arrived that evening, their truck tires crunching over the gravel. They'd come not for salvage, but for remembrance. Among them was a young woman, Dr. Isla Mendoza, who carried with her an old blueprint she had found in a forgotten government archive. The paper was yellowed, edges burned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Reeve W. Experimental Intake Flow Study, 1949. She stepped inside the hangar, brushing away cobwebs and dust. A shaft of golden light filtered through a hole in the roof, falling across the spot where Reeve's first prototype had once stood. Isla knelt and unfolded the blueprint on the ground. The curved line, simple perfect, still ran through the page, the same arc that had changed the fate of flight. One of her colleagues asked softly, "Do you really think this old man's work matters now with what we're building?" She looked up, eyes steady. Every ship that leaves this planet still needs to breathe before it breaks the sky. And this, she pointed to the curve, this is how humanity learned to breathe with it. Outside, the desert wind began to rise, swirling through the broken doors. The sound filled the hangar, low and resonant, wrapping around the blueprint, as if the air itself recognized the name written there. For a moment, it almost sounded like an engine coming to life. Isla closed her eyes. She imagined him standing there again, older, weathered, stubborn, staring up at the endless horizon with that half-smile of defiance. He hadn't built for glory. He had built for understanding, for harmony, for the day when humanity would finally stop shouting at the heavens and start listening. The team packed up as twilight deepened. Before leaving, Isla placed the blueprint on the workbench and pressed a hand against the wood. "You won, Mr. Reeve," she whispered. "The world just took a little longer to hear you." When they drove away, the hangar fell silent once more, but not empty. The wind swept through the open rafters, carrying grains of sand that shimmered in the dying light. From afar, the old building looked almost alive again, humming faintly as the last rays of sun turned its rusted walls to gold. High above a jet crossed the darkening sky, its contrail bending into a graceful arc before fading into the evening. For an instant it looked like a signature, a silent salute written in vapor and fire. And then, just as the desert night swallowed the light, the wind whispered the words that had once defined a man's entire life. "You don't command the air. You earn its trust." Somewhere between the earth and the stars, Walter Reeve was still listening.